Also, the president tweeted today, our people want to return to work. He tweeted, they will practice social distancing and all else, and seniors will be watched over protectively and lovingly. We can do two things together. The cure cannot be worse by far than the problem. Congress must act now. We will come back strong. He has suggested last night and on Twitter and in his briefing and again now today that he thinks people should go back sooner rather than later, which is in contradiction with his own task force, with Dr. Fauci and others. What would be your message about whether, as reluctant as people are to see the economy tank, whether we have to get past this surge before we can consider coming back? And it is going to be more than 2 weeks.
Oh, as I said, this is not a time for notion mongering. It is a time for serious, evidence-based, scientific decision making. Scientists speaking truth to power. You can look at the examples around the world and where there was confinement, where people stayed at home. If you look at China, in Wuhan, they didn't do this early enough, 100,000 cases. In Singapore and Hong Kong, where they acted differently, a teeny percentage of that number infected. So when the president says, if you ask the doctors, they want to shut everything down, I think that was one of his other tributes to science, that you can't go to that place. And the cost to the economy of many more people getting affected and sick is a bigger cost than we're even seeing now. We don't want that to happen. We want the markets to go up. We want them to see hope and confidence that we're on a path to get the job done, whether it's seeking a cure, providing interim benefits for people who might lose their jobs, helping small businesses stay in business and thrive, stay in business at least until a time when they can thrive again, and to do so in a way that, again, puts workers first. That's just what it is. So we've been putting families and workers first. We passed three. Would be the third bill, but the first two were about research, development, about masks, about testing. We're so far behind in testing, and it's no use going into if only, if only, if only. My granddaughter Bella said to me the other day, it's no use, Mimi, just saying, if only they had tested sooner, if only they had used better tests, if only they had not fired the people who were doing this work. And it's just no more if onlys. Let's talk about what we're going to do about it. We can have an after-action review later about some of this. But the fact is we cannot continue to make statements about what should come next if they're not based on science and evidence and data of people who know more about this than any of us.
Dr. Fauci has not been seen at recent briefings with the president. There's a lot of solid reporting that the president is not happy about the way he pushed back against some of the president's pronouncements on drugs that had not been properly tested and using other drugs, alternative drugs, before they were approved. Would the Congress, would you be concerned if Dr. Fauci is pushed down after having served since the Reagan years or not listened to?
Yes, of course. Dr. Fauci has been on a pedestal for many years for many of us who've worked with him. I started over 30 years ago on HIV and AIDS, and he was our champion. George W. Herbert Walker Bush at that time called him a hero, his hero, when they asked him who his hero was. Over time, he has been a tremendous intellectual and scientific source to every challenge we have faced. And I, frankly, myself thought, I don't know where the scientists were, that the president was making some of the decisions or statements, not I would say decisions, that he made about being in denial about the scope of the virus at the beginning. And I've made my views known to Dr. Fauci. But Dr. Fauci is a truth teller. He's science, knowledge, evidence, data. And that's what we have to have if we're going to have a cure and not just, I heard this works. He made a plea against anecdotal evidence, anecdotal stories that give people some hope that may or may not be, the standard being, is it efficacy and safety? Those are the two things. Is it going to be effective? Or is it going to hurt you or be safe? And I think that nobody has a clearer picture of that than Dr. Fauci. And the country would be very well served if the decision makers listened to the science when it comes to issues regarding how we can stop this plague from what the president is suggesting is really a formula for more uncertainty, more infections, and more harm to the economy.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.